One of the most important skills that you could ever learn is your ability to have difficult conversations. Now, there's all kinds of difficult conversations in life, from giving bad news to offering feedback in your personal and professional life. And your ability to be able to have these conversations and communicate in the most impactful way can determine the trajectory of your life in many, many cases. Over the course of this episode of the Changing Minds podcast, I'm going to walk you through the most important insights ever described in the area of how to have difficult conversations more effectively. We're going to dive into what specifically do you need to know and how do you need to prepare for any conversation so that you can maximize the likelihood that you get the result you're looking for. We're going to pour over 3 powerful books: Nonviolent Communication, Crucial Conversations, and Difficult Conversations, and extract from those the most important ideas in this field. This is going to be so helpful. Looking forward to getting stuck in. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and I hope that this is not going to be a difficult conversation. I hope that you're not dreading me talking to you, because it's not really a conversation, it's really me talking. Although if you reply back in the comments, it's kind of like we're interacting with each other, but hopefully it's not going to be difficult. So often when we hear about something that's difficult, we think to ourselves, oh, that's difficult because it's hard for us to comprehend or it's hard for us to get our head around. But whenever we talk about difficult conversations, we're not really thinking in terms of that type of difficulty. Most of the time, we would not describe a conversation that we have about advanced mathematical theory as difficult. Instead, when we talk about difficult conversations, we're really talking about conversations that don't make us feel good, or conversations that we know won't make other people feel good. And that really is the beginning of this session, because in this session of the Change Your Minds podcast, I'm going to walk you through exactly what difficult conversations are, why they're so difficult, but most importantly, I'm going to offer you the most important strategies that you need to know in order for you to be much better at having these kind of conversations. In many ways, we're going to look at some of the best literature out there in the area. We're going to be talking about things like nonviolent communication and some of the lessons we can learn from that approach. We're going to look at difficult conversations themselves, and we're also going to look at Crucial Conversations, the book, which sort of points a finger at difficult conversations and suggests that having these kind of tough conversations is really, really important if we are to be as successful as we want to be. So in order for us to be able to get a lot of the results we want, it's crucial, if you'll forgive the pun, that we get really skilled in this area. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to open up, hopefully, a toolbox of ideas which will allow you to prepare for these conversations when you have to have them. And again, it doesn't matter what context you're in. If you're not feeling good about that conversation, or you know that it's not going to make the other person feel good, that qualifies as a tough conversation. And therefore, we're going to provide you with exactly what you need in order to do this. But let's start by asking the question, well, why is a difficult conversation difficult? And we kind of alluded to it at the start. A conversation is difficult because of how it makes us feel. Let me say that again. A conversation is difficult because of how it makes us feel. But it's not just how it makes us feel, it's also how it makes the other person feel. So if I'm about to have a difficult conversation with you, it's not just that I feel bad about the conversation, it's I might feel bad because you are going to feel bad. So I'm going to give you feedback, and as a result of that, I feel bad about giving you the feedback because I think the feedback will make you feel bad. Or I'm going to share bad news with you, and I feel bad about the bad news because I feel that me giving you the bad news is going to make you feel bad because it's bad news, which kind of makes sense. Because, of course, if you give bad news, people are going to feel bad. And I'm not saying that you can give bad news and people feel good and what's that? My bank accounts were emptied. Oh, well, it's bad news, but I kind of feel like that's not what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm not saying that you can suddenly make good news sound bad or bad news sound good, but I am saying that you can make it so that it hits their emotions less. What we're really looking to do is to minimize the impact, the negative impact that we might have when we're communicating something that we find is quite difficult. We want to be able to soft land these conversations in the most effective manner. And so as we go through this today, what we're going to be identifying is really what are some of the things we need to be able to be better at in order for us to be able to get the message across in such a way that maximizes the likelihood that people feel okay whenever they hear the news coming from us. Now, let's talk initially, since we've talked about the fact that emotions are really what leads us to have difficult conversations be difficult. Let's talk about how this works in the brain. What is the neuroscience or the neurochemistry of difficult conversations? Well, first of all, there's obviously the stress response. So what happens is in our brain, we have, of course, the limbic system, which is kind of like very, very much in the sort of the middle of the brain. And it's very much responsible or connected to, should I say, the way in which your emotions work. There's a part of the limbic system called the amygdala. And the amygdala, one of the things that it's known for is it's a threat detector and it's also an opportunity detector. So it's able to figure out and evaluate whether something needs to have your full attention. And if, for example, it perceives something as a threat, then oftentimes it can start a chain reaction, which in turn allows us to trigger the release of cortisol, which is a stress hormone or known as the stress hormone, as well as adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what happens there is this sort of threat that's detected stimulates or activates what we call the sympathetic nervous system. So typically speaking, there's two really types of activation. There's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is activated whenever we're relaxed and chilled and like everything's good. And then there's the sympathetic nervous system, which kicks in whenever we're like fight or fright, right? Whenever our heart is beating fast, adrenaline's pumping through our body, cortisol's, in us as well. And so whenever we're trying to have a difficult conversation, part of why it's difficult is because we're trying to have a conversation with regards to these chemicals raging in our body. Now, if you think about it, just to give you a little bit of historical context for this, the function of things like adrenaline and cortisol is that it allowed us to be able to survive back in the hunter-gatherer days. So for thousands of years, these chemicals were great because they gave us the requisite energy to be able to run or hide from things like lions or saber-toothed tigers, right? So they allowed us to survive because they gave us the requisite energy. But the reality is that nowadays, many of the threats that we need to face are threats that we need to deal with, not by fighting or running or hiding, but by conversation. And the problem with that is that adrenaline, epinephrine, cortisol, these kind of chemicals are not conducive to us having conversations in a rational, easy way. We've never had to have a conversation with a lion. If a lion's coming over to you and it's like, "Oh, I'm going to eat you," which it doesn't say, but it's like the subtext of the body language. You can see it in its face, right? We've all seen lions about to eat. You know they're going to eat you. You just know. And if the lion's coming towards you, you know that one strategy is not going to work is to say, "Hey, listen, lion, I don't know what your name is, but I know you're a lion. Pause for a second." The lion's not going to stop and go, "Oh, well, I was hungry, but now that you've told me to stop, I'm going to stop. Yes, go ahead." And then you say, "Listen, I understand you're hungry, but there's lots of other choices. Maybe we can work together." Like that's not possible as a difficult conversation. You can't have difficult conversations with lions. So everything you're about to learn is not going to help you if you're trying to converse difficult conversations with lions, because there is no difficult conversation. They don't have conversations with you. I don't know why you would think otherwise. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get your adrenaline up a bit just so that maybe, we're creating the feeling so that you can start to manage it in the moment. Anyway, let me continue where I left off. We're in a situation where our neurochemistry is like going crazy and it's getting us ready to run or hide or fight, and yet we have to have a conversation. And that's the first problem. We need to be able to learn to regulate our nervous system. Now, one of the ways that we can regulate our nervous system is through the frontal part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of our brain that typically is able to make decisions and rationalizes, and it's connected to the other parts of our brain in different networks. But what we really need to do is we really need to start to focus on how we can start to leverage this part of our brain effectively so we can start to regulate and manage the emotions that we feel. So we're able to make it so that those feelings that we have and the adrenaline that we have and the cortisol that is pumping through our system at that moment in time, we're able to mitigate the impact of that. Because in order for us to be able to have difficult conversations, we need to be able to get ourselves in a place where we're in the right emotional state. And that's really what we need to learn to do. Now, there's lots of techniques out there that can help you to do that, from mindfulness to meditation to NLP to CBT to a whole host. But what we're really looking to be able to do is understand what's at stake, what's happening. We'll talk about a few different emotional strategies we can use. But fundamentally, we want to get ourselves in the best position possible. So we're thinking, how can I have the best possible conversation? And how can I leverage whatever energy I do have in the most optimal way to be able to get the right result? The other element that's important to recognize is that there's also an element of a chemical called oxytocin that is crucial for us to cultivate whenever we're having difficult conversations. Oxytocin is sometimes known as the cuddle chemical or the love hormone, but fundamentally it's really about bonding and empathy. So whenever you empathize with a person, whenever you care about a person, whenever you connect or bond with a person, that's the feeling of that is the feeling of oxytocin in our system. And so what we really want to be able to do is we want to be able to become the architects of oxytocin. Do you like that? The architects of oxytocin really sounds fancy. You're going to be very popular at parties if you start to say, what do you do? I'm the architect of oxytocin. People are going to love you. They're going to say, oh my goodness, you're so smart. I don't even know really what oxytocin is, but architect of oxytocin? Maybe don't try it. I haven't been to too many parties lately, so. Anyway, the point is you can be an architect of oxytocin by simply learning how can you create the right kinds of connections with the people that you're talking to as you're delivering a difficult conversation. Why? Because if they're experiencing oxytocin, they're going to be less negatively impacted. Why? Because oxytocin also helps us to trust other people more. So if they trust you more, then a difficult conversation is going to land significantly better. Part of the reason that adrenaline and cortisol don't help us to listen well is also because we feel that we're being threatened. Therefore, threat is pretty much the opposite of trust. And if you want people to trust you, not only do you have to reduce the intensity of these kind of chemicals, you also have to increase the intensity of something like oxytocin as a result. There's also the experience that we have whenever we're in a difficult situation. Sometimes with the adrenaline will come some of the positive chemicals as well, things like endorphins or endocannabinoids, which typically happen whenever our brain is telling us we're in a certain experience. And so there's sometimes a positive feeling that we will get along with the pain or along with the emotional pain, let's say, of a difficult conversation. It's almost like thrilling to a degree. And that's why sometimes people can actually be addicted to arguments or addicted to fighting because they get a kick out of it, right? So if you get a kick out of difficult conversations, you're probably not watching this video. You're probably, relishing it. You're like, I don't need to handle difficult conversations. I love difficult conversations. They're the best. I love giving people bad news. I love giving people negative feedback. I love criticizing. I love telling people something's not going to work out. I love saying no to people. Oh, it's the best. If you're that kind of person, please never watch any of my videos. That's terrifying. That kind of maligned approach to life is just scary. But what is important is to recognize that all of these different kind of chemicals, there's also dopamine involved, right? Dopamine is obviously the motivation molecule. It's to do with anticipation and rewards. And once again, whenever we're communicating with somebody, one of the things we have to recognize is part of our job might be to try to keep them motivated. So you're trying to give feedback to someone, but you want to motivate them. So how do we do that? How do we motivate people in the most successful way? And dopamine is really the chemical that we're trying to trigger the release of if we are to motivate them also. So the reason I wanted to bring up some of the neurochemical features is because when you're having a difficult conversation, it's important to try to understand what's at play, what's actually going on. And sometimes when we have a physical manifestation of certain chemicals, we know that we need to do something about them. And that means that it brings to life some of the strategies that we're going to be talking about. So when we look back at some of the theories, obviously, Socrates had a bunch of difficult conversations. That dude was asking all these questions, and eventually because the conversations pissed so many people off, they dragged him into prison, accused him of being like a bad influence or whatever, and then he ended up being forced to drink hemlock, right? But the reason that conversations were difficult was because he kept asking questions, and when people don't know the answers to questions, they start to feel bad about themselves. And so if you look at it, a lot of the kind of earliest understandings we have about difficult conversations really speak to the importance of the approach that we take whenever we're communicating with people. If you look at it, Aristotle also talked about the importance of not just ethos and logos, which is the character of the persuader or the logical appeal of the persuader, but also pathos, which is the emotional appeal. So in other words, in order for you to be as persuasive as possible, you need to change the way the other person feels. And if you think about it, a difficult conversation, what is it but an effort that you have to try to influence a person in the most effective way? And a big part of that influence is influence in how they feel. And since what makes a difficult conversation the way you feel and the way the other person feels, a big part is how can I make that other person feel better or not to feel as bad as they currently do. That's really what you're trying to accomplish. In the mid-20th century, we had philosophies or approaches to therapy like Carl Rogers came along, and he had Rogerian client-centered counseling or Rogerian client-centered therapy. And he really talked about three things: congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard, right? And the congruence piece was making sure that you're aligned with your message and you're communicating congruently. Empathy and active listening is really about understanding the other person, understanding what matters to the other person. And then unconditional positive regard is really the ability to turn up and show up and have a sort of a positive sense of respect, right? So it's the opposite of judging the person. And really those approaches or those three sort of areas or elements became synonymous with his kind of approach to therapy and approach to counseling. And a big part of it involved letting the other person speak and letting them express what was going on. It's a very common form of therapy at the moment, is the ability to let the other person talk. If you ever contact a depressive hotline or suicidal hotline, typically a big part of it is they give you the space and the unconditional positive regard to speak and to express what's going on for you, which is wonderful, because a lot of people actually don't have some opportunity to do that in their life, and that can really help people when they're struggling with that. But fundamentally, Rogers' approach was really about some of the most difficult conversations, because what can be more difficult than talking about how much you hate life, for example, or how much you're struggling in different aspects of life. So there's some things that we can learn from there, of course. There's also a guy called Thomas Gordon who really dove in even deeper to this notion that Rogers was sort of talking about, which is active listening. And active listening in the sort of the 1970s became all the rage. It's a sort of a communication technique that emphasizes fully concentrating and really paying attention to what the other person says. I like a lot of parts of it in the sense that it's really about paying attention to the other person. But there was certain like parts of the technique that I wasn't a big fan of. For example, okay, eye contact. So always make sure you're making eye contact with them, right? Right? Make eye contact, don't blink. I'm kidding, he didn't say don't blink, but he may as well, because it was like maintain eye contact. And a lot of people take that too far. And therefore, whenever they're doing therapy or even having a conversation, they're terrifying. But there was eye contact. There's an open posture, whatever that means. I'm being open now. Come on, tell me. That just is weird. That wouldn't work either. And then you also have the nodding and the angle of the head as well. It's like, yes. And then you paraphrase back to them. So I'm hearing you say, so I'm hearing you. And while I think there's a good understanding, the problem is when people start to do it like on purpose like this, it becomes a bit too orchestrated and a bit too over the top, and you're looking at it and going, oh, that's a bit weird, and it doesn't feel right and it feels uncomfortable. And sometimes they'll like joke around about it in terms of TV episodes or whatnot. You'll have a couple that went to some form of active listening and couples therapy, and they come back and going, I'm hearing you say blah, 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 but I'm feeling this way, and I'm hearing you say, and I really want to make that as a caveat for the rest of what I'm going to go through, because what I'm going to share today are really useful techniques. But if we overdo them or stick rigidly to them, or we make it a little bit clunky and a little bit like overt, then it can rub people the wrong way, and it can actually be counter-helpful. Is that a word, counter-helpful? I don't think it is. I don't think counter-helpful is a word. I've never heard it before. I've just said it for the first time. But I think it's a great word, great term. It's two words put together, obviously, but I think it works. So we're going to stick with counter-helpful. So I think it's counter-helpful. I know there's a way better word than counter-helpful that I can't think of right now. You know, you're going, oh my goodness, Owen, it's whatever the word is. See, if I knew it, I would have said it, but it's counter-helpful. And it'd be even counter-helpful if you interrupted my video. So let's keep going. Anyway, you avoid interrupting. You need to be fully present. All those good things, of course, are really, really helpful, really, really useful. But what I want to do is I want to dive into three of the most important, most powerful books in this field, which really do comprehensively explore some of the most important techniques and strategies that you need to have in order for you to be way better at difficult conversation. And we're going to start off with Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life by Marshall Rosenberg. And this became a sort of a whole approach, right? Nonviolent communication. And there's a number of different elements to it. I'm not going to walk you through the whole book and go, oh, in chapter 1 and chapter 2, because I'm probably the only person that would probably enjoy that, because I'm like, oh, give me it structured and observed. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the most important principles that Rosenberg talked about in this particular book and the approach as a whole. The first one is that we need to observe without judging. And this is something obviously aligned with the Rogerian approach, but it's very much focusing on the facts of what a person's saying, the facts of what a person did, not the interpretations or assumptions. And that's what did you notice? And a good sort of rule of thumb of this is always trying to make it so that anything that you observe is something that you could describe in terms of what you see or what you hear. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you notice? Not what does it mean? Not who are they? Not what were they thinking, right? Instead, we're very much focused on what did you see? What did you hear? What did you feel in terms of feeling physically, right? So physical sensations. So it's always about your observation. And so the first piece here, and this is something you'll hear time and time again, but observe without judgment. Not going in, saying what it means, but we stop at that area of this is what I've observed, this is what I've noticed. Now, if you do have judgments about it, maybe you will be able to share, but you want to separate it first and foremost and observe. That's the most important thing. The second thing is identify and express feelings. So identify the feelings that you have without, again, mixing the two. So you want to be able to go, this is what I observed, and this is what I felt about what I observed. But you're not saying this is what you meant to do, this is what it meant, this is how it would make anyone feel. You're simply describing, these are the facts, and these are my feelings. And it's important for us to separate those two, because the problem with most difficult conversations is two people have a very different model of the world. There's a concept in neuroscience called affective realism, which is the notion that we see the world differently depending on how we feel. So the affect, the way in which we feel, influences what we focus on and how we interpret and how we conceptualize the world. And so the problem with that is that I could be talking to you about a particular thing. Like, let's say, I'm not going to bring up anything too controversial. Let's say the presidential election. You get it? And let's say you feel really angry about the fact that Trump won. Let's say you feel really delighted about the fact that Trump won. If a person who feels really delighted and a person who feels really angry about the fact that Trump won try to have a conversation, it's going to be so hard because their realities are different. The stories they tell themselves are different. And regardless of who's right or wrong, which is not my place to say, the fact is that these two realities are going to battle against each other. And so what we are doing in these things is we're observing without judging. In other words, they're just describing, this is what I've observed and this is how I feel about what I've observed. And that's difficult to do because you have to avoid the temptation to say a judgment about it. This is so unfair. He is such a, she is such a, whatever. We have to step back and go, this is what I've observed and this is how I feel about it. And we're describing the feelings separate to the facts. And that's a really, really important skill that isn't always easy to do, but when we get it, when we get good at it, it really, really helps. The next one is identify the need behind the feelings. So more often than not, this is based upon the premise that the feelings that we have reflect an unmet need that we have. So if we feel fearful, it means that we have an unmet need for security and to reinforced. If we feel anger or rage, again, there's a need underlying that, maybe a need for justice, right? Where we feel our boundaries have been negatively impacted. So by looking and understanding what is the need behind the feeling that you have, and hopefully helping understand what the need is behind the other person's emotions, that once again allows you to be able to start to compartmentalize. You've got the what you observe, how you feel about what you observe, and then the needs that are unmet as a result of your feelings, or the needs that are unmet that lead to the feelings that you're experiencing right now. And by understanding what the unmet needs are, by understanding what your feelings are, and by understanding what the facts are, you're just putting yourself in a position where you're much more likely to be able to communicate really effectively from a difficult perspective. So when you're talking about something hard, you're organizing your mind in a really powerful way, which I think is really great stuff. The next one is make clear requests, not demands. So instead of like telling people, you have to do this or you have to do that. And sometimes we don't even know. Like, I know people that will ask me to do something, and I'll be very close to them, but the way in which they ask me is not, would you? It's do that now. And even sometimes they'll say, please, but the tone of their voice is not please. And so often we just immediately make demands. And the problem with demands is when we do that, how do we think it makes the other person feel? It automatically will make the other person feel like you're telling them what to do. And nobody likes to be told what to do. There's a concept in psychology called reactance, where we have a tendency to react against whenever someone is trying to exert influence over us. And this is something that we start experiencing from the age of 1.5, even before that. So if you look at it, what's most children's first word? What is it? if you're being honest, it's not mama or dada or papa. It's no. Kids start by saying no. That's the first word. And so they're reacting right from the get-go. This reactance, as it's known, is a real phenomenon. And so when you make a demand, you're automatically triggering something that the person in front of you has been experiencing from as early as they can remember, before they could remember. So instead, we need to make clear requests. Would you be willing to actually ask for what is it that you're looking for, and to be able to frame what you want them to do as a request? It's really, really vital. Even sometimes when we give advice, we say, you know what you should do? Would it be great if or could you consider this? Or would it be possible to think about this? Giving them options in a question form softens it and makes people more likely to listen. Why? Because they don't have reactance kicking in at that moment in time. The next one is empathizing with others as well as yourself. Now, this is an important one because oftentimes we have an empathy gap. And the empathy gap, there's a few different types, but like one type of empathy gap is the gap between how the other person feels and how you think that they feel. So there's a gap between your understanding of their feelings and their actual feelings. And you close that gap by spending more time paying attention to them, knows their body language, their tone of voice, the word choice they're using, comparing that with the default of how they are normally, putting yourself in their shoes, thinking a bit more of their background. All of the stuff that you would do to empathize with someone will help you to be able to understand them better. And empathy is really, there's two types. There's cognitive empathy, where you understand what they're thinking, and there's emotional empathy, where you understand how they're feeling. And the more that you ask yourself, what is their goal? What are they trying to achieve? What are they scared of? What do they not want? What do they value? What's important to them? What are their priorities? Right? What are the pains or consequences they'll experience if they don't solve their problems? What is urgent for them right now? The more we start to think through this, as well as what's their background from a cultural perspective, thinking about their generation, right? All of these, thinking about their personality, everything that you can possibly understand about a person can help you to empathize with them. But we also need to look at the other empathy gap, which is the empathy gap to do it ourselves. Because so often we might think, oh, I'll be fine. But actually something triggers us more than we expect it to. So we need to start to listen to our own feelings and our own needs in the moment. Because sometimes we can project. Have you ever done that? Where you're actually feeling quite shitty about yourself, so you make somebody else feel bad as well? Like you're feeling condescended to, but actually they haven't been condescending. You just in your own mind might be a little bit more insecure. Now, maybe sometimes they might be condescending, but sometimes we can misinterpret another person's behavior based upon how we feel. Remember that effective realism thing. We can interpret what they're doing and think to ourselves, oh, they think this. Maybe they don't think this, but maybe you're projecting it. So we need to recognize and develop a really acute sense of self-awareness as well. How are we feeling? And what triggered that feeling? What's going on for us, right? How are we conceptualizing this moment? What story are we telling ourselves about this? That's what we're looking for. And then is also about prioritizing and fostering connection over argument. So it's more important for us to understand the other person's point of view and to connect with them and to build a healthy, good relationship where we can trust each other than it is for us to agree on everything. So it's almost like accepting that we might not agree on everything, but we understand the other person. We try to put ourselves in their shoes. And this is, again, something missing in the modern day, is that when someone's a different political view than us, we immediately jump to conclusions and go, the reason they have a different view to us is because they hate X, right? They hate free speech. They hate this. They hate that. It's always the same way, right? We position someone as a fascist or a communist, and that absolves us of the need to actually have conversations with them. We can stay in a nice little world where I'm on the right side of this and they're a fascist. I'm on the right side of this and they're a communist. Right? Isn't that lovely? The nice little labels we throw out there and it's fine. But the reality is, if we want to be more effective, we need to start to find more connections, foster more connections, as opposed to needing to agree on everything. That brings in the importance of the concept of respect. Next book I want to share some insights from is what we call Crucial Conversations. The subtitle here is Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High by Kerry Patterson, Joseph Grenny, Ron McMillan, and Al Switzler. Now, having 4 people writing a book already, I'm pretty impressed. Already these 4 authors must be using some of these techniques, because there's a lot of difficult conversations, I'm sure, when 4 people are trying to work on a book. How do they agree on all the content? Legend has it that they started writing this book in 1920 and they only finished it 2 years ago. So that was a joke. No, it's older than 2 years ago. And They didn't start writing it 2000. It's just, first of all, start with the heart. And what we mean by start with the heart is focus on what you want and ensure that it's mutual purpose. So what you're really trying to do is align whatever you're coming from a good place. That's really, when we talk about it, that's what we mean. It's start from a good place. Start from the place where you're actively trying to obviously achieve what you want, but you also want the other person to get what they want as well. You're trying to accomplish both. You want to master your emotions and the stories and to be able to separate the facts from the stories that you tell yourself, so challenging the unhelpful narratives. Now, story is another way of describing the interpretation that we give to whatever facts happen. So there's the facts of what we observe, and then there's what that means. And whereas in the nonviolent communication, we kind of talked about facts and feelings and then the unmet needs, here we're kind of going in the middle of facts and feelings, and we're going, in order for you to have the feelings about the facts, you tell yourself a story. So separating the fact from the story and identifying this is the fact, this is what I observed, this is definitely true, this is the story I'm telling myself, it's about understanding that narrative and understanding how that narrative might prevent you from listening to the other person's perspective or understanding the other person's perspective or hearing the other person's perspective. So we need to understand what story we're telling ourselves about the incident that we're talking about. The next one is state your path. And this really means using what they call the STATE method, which is share, tell, ask, talk, and encourage. And I'm going to walk you through this in a moment. Exploring other people's perspectives, other people's paths means really actively listening and hearing their point of view, validating their other perspectives, having respect for the fact that they've come up with what they've come up with and try to understand them. The real key here is understanding them as deeply as we can. And then finally, moving to action, making sure we're clear on the agreements and the next steps so that we can prevent disagreements moving forward. We could prevent misunderstandings, at least, moving forward. And so this whole STATE method that they use starts off with state your facts. And so a good example of this would be the last two meetings, this is what wasn't covered, or we didn't cover all the agenda items, for instance. Tell your story. I'm concerned that we're falling behind on our project timeline. So in other words, you're starting with this is what we can both agree on. This is almost like my feelings, or let's say in this context, my story, right? This is what I'm worried about. Ask for other people's paths. How do you see it? What's your take on this? So you're being open enough. You're not asking a yes or no. You're asking what's your perspective, because you're trying to get them involved in the conversation and they get then to tell their story. You talk tentatively, it seems to me that, or I'm getting the sense that, or I'm wondering that. And this is really, it's almost like a great strategy to validate, because you're checking in with them and you're trying to show that you understand them. And they can then correct you and then they can clarify. But it allows both of you to sort of clarify to each other exactly what your perspective is. So when you're having a difficult conversation, by you being able to be more tentative as opposed to going, you're so wrong, or I knew you were going to say that, or I know what you're thinking. Instead, you go, I'm getting this sense, or I'm getting the idea that would this be true? You're checking in with them tentatively, which is great. And then encourage testing. What am I missing? Do you see it differently? You're trying to allow them the opportunity to be able to share. And that whole STATE method isn't something you do once, and it's something that you keep doing. It's like cyclical. It's something that you do a number of times on both sides to be able to try to get to the point where you truly understand what's going on. And that's really what we're looking for. We're trying to get understanding. We're trying to get both parties to the point that they can do that. Now, some of the other things that they recommended was make sure that you make it safe. In other words, create a safe space whereby you can have these conversations where both parties feel they'll be respected and heard and they have a sense of privacy. Work on mastering emotions. Again, some of the things we talked about earlier, to be able to reduce the likelihood that the emotions will take you over. Separate to this, and it's not necessarily in the book, but a great technique to be able to master emotions is to remind yourself, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish or achieve in this particular conversation? Because that will often avoid you falling into the trap of allowing the emotion to dictate the direction you go in. When you're focusing on the goal, you're keeping what needs to be paramount. And as a result of that, you're much more likely to actually engage in the behaviors that makes you more likely to hit that goal. Whereas when you go with what you feel, that's when problems can take place. Maintain respect all the way through. Identify what they call silence or violence. So whenever someone just shuts down, ever been talking to someone and they go, okay. If they do that, you're in trouble. And if they're your partner, oh, I feel so sorry for you. You're in so much trouble. Because if they're going silent on you, that's like That's DEFCON 5. You know what DEFCON 5 is? I can't remember if it's DEFCON 1 is the worst or DEFCON 5 is the worst. Whichever one of the ones is the worst. If it goes upward, then at DEFCON 5, they're DEFCON 5. If they go downward, it's like DEFCON 1 is like nuclear war. You're in DEFCON 1. So you're in big trouble. Why? Because it's like they're silent. It's the silent treatment. You want to identify that and knock it out. If they're silent, you want to pause, stop, and make sure you bring them back into the conversation. It's really important. Or violence. Violence isn't necessarily physical violence per se. It's just the shouting or screaming. That's also not useful. It's not conducive. You can't have an effective, difficult conversation with someone shouting. That's the equivalent of the difficult conversation we talked about earlier with the lion, right? You can't talk to a lion. Again, how many times do I have to tell you? You can't talk to a lion by shouting at them. Okay, sorry. Keep bringing back the lion thing. I'm telling you the truth, though. I'm not lying. Are you tired of all these puns yet? No? All right. I don't want to cheat you out of it. But anyway, I thought that one was perfect. All right, I'll stop. I promise. I'll promise. Right. Okay. Third book that we're going to look at is Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Heen. And so the first thing here is understand the three conversations. We'll see a pattern here. Every difficult conversation has three layers. The factual conversation, what happened, the feelings conversation, how it impacted emotions, and the identity conversation, this is how it affects the way people feel about themselves or their self-esteem. So there's the facts conversation, the feelings conversation, and the self-esteem. So it's really, this is what happened, this is what I feel about what happened, and this is how I feel about myself in relation to what happened as well, which is particularly important. The key is to shift from blame to contribution. So it's less about who's to blame or less about the past, and it's much more about how can we contribute to solving this moving forward. Separate intent from impact, right? So whatever your intent was, this was the impact. So sometimes people will absolve themselves of all responsibility. Well, I didn't mean it. Yeah, but even if you didn't mean it, this is the impact. So if it's the impact, we still need to do something about that. It doesn't mean that you have to feel super guilty, but it just means we need to find ways to be able to try to make things better moving forward and get things better in a more effective way. The next thing that we need to do is we need to be able to explore the other person's story. That means to try to understand to the best of our ability the other person's point of view and perspective. The more we can really get into understanding what their thoughts are, what the facts they've observed, their feelings about it, how they feel about how it affects them or their self-esteem or identity, the more we can understand what's going on for another person, the more likely we are to be able to have a productive conversation with them in that moment in time. So we really need to try to do our best. We also want to acknowledge and express emotions. So we need to acknowledge the emotion that they feel and express the emotions that we feel. So get the feelings out there on the table. Because once again, if we're hiding the emotions, then oftentimes the emotions will hide in this sort of projected form of truth that we communicate to each other, the stories that we're telling to the other person. We want to be very clear, this is how I feel. And feelings doesn't make it fact, but we want to make sure that people know this is indeed what I'm feeling about this whole thing. Lastly, we want to adopt a learning stance and we want to be curious. Being curious means we genuinely want to learn more about the other person's point of view. We want to learn more about how they're thinking. We want to learn more about why they have the take that they have on this. And to try to craft a mutual understanding where we can truly understand each other. We can share the clarity of why we're on the side we're on or why we believe what we believe. They do the same thing. And then kumbaya. Kumbaya. Not really sure what kumbaya means, but I know it's like that whole thing that I was like, kumbaya, peace, kumbaya. I should have looked that up beforehand. Whatever it means, but sure, look, it is what it is. Mike, do you know what kumbaya means?
Coming by you? Is that it?
Well, the fact that Mike doesn't really know or isn't so sure, it's like I kind of feel more justified. So if he doesn't know it, then it's kind of normal not to know what kumbaya means, but we kind of get it anyway. So one of the most important takeaways for you to walk away with, if you were to have difficult conversation, you're like, Owen, first of all, let me say a big thank you for going through those 3 books. This is great. I'm going to read them and I'm going to study them. I'm going to be so much better as a result. Also, thank you for everything else, Owen. Well, what I'd love to know though, Owen, is could you just give me some bullet points about what I need to do to be better at difficult conversations? And you know what? I'm glad that you asked, because that's exactly what I'm going to do. And so, number 1, we need to understand, first of all, when we're in a situation with another person, try to understand all the different factors at play, the power dynamics at play, the cultural elements at play, the generational elements at play. In other words, study the person you're talking to. When you come to the table having a difficult conversation with another person, you need to first recognize and understand where are they in the in the history of the world, every difficult conversation that's ever been performed effectively has started with understanding the other person. It's not about just what you have to say. It's about reading the other person first, trying to understand their perspective and why they believe what they believe. So we need to understand the power dynamics, the cultural differences, the generational differences, and we need to understand the other person. We need to identify and prepare for triggers. So know as we have this conversation, there's going to be elements or situations or parts of it where we're going to be triggered or things we have to monitor them being triggered on. So we need to start to identify what are the possible triggers that are going to come up and how do I handle them if I feel that I'm being triggered, and what do I need to do to minimize the likelihood of the other person being triggered? Why does that matter? Because if they're triggered, that means they're going to be feeling this emotion. And when we're feeling emotion strongly, it's often harder for us to actually think in a more rational way. And that's really important for us to do when we're trying to have these kind of conversations. Third, focus on a long-term relationship. So never think of a difficult conversation going, okay, I'm going to win this difficult conversation. And as soon as I beat them in this difficult conversation, I mean, even saying it is ridiculous, right? But that's the way we think of negotiations, which happen to also be difficult conversations. But we think, I'm going to win this negotiation. As soon as you're thinking of winning and losing, you're not thinking about winning. Because real winning is winning the relationship, is making it so that the relationship long term is better as a result. And if you don't have a difficult conversation, if you avoid a difficult conversation with somebody, what you're doing is you're putting your head in the sand, and as a result of it, the small little issue between you and them may well grow up to be a much bigger issue as a result. So by the time that you actually deal with it, it might be too late. Or even if it's not too late, it might be a hell of a lot harder to have a conversation with them than it might have been if you just nipped it in the bud first and foremost. So thinking long term about the relationship is critical. Prepare emotionally and regulate your stress response. Get your mindset into a place where before you actually have the conversation, you're in the most relaxed state possible. You know and are clear of the goal that you have, what you want to accomplish, how you want the other person to feel. The more you're walking through, how do I want them to feel? How do I want them to be thinking about this? What's the belief I want them to leave with? What is the action I'm looking for? But again, starting with how do I want them to feel? How are they feeling? What's the gap between the two? The more we think through those kind of things, the more easy it'll be for us to be able to stay on point ourselves. And also, what is the best state that we can be in order for us to maximize the likelihood that this conversation goes the way we want it to? Never in the history of the world has somebody turned around and go, you know what, I think if I'm just really defensive in this conversation, it's gonna work. I'm just gonna be super defensive. But yet we are defensive. Why is it we know that's a terrible strategy and yet we fall into it? It's because it's not a strategy, it's a reaction. And instead, we need to be more deliberate, more proactive in our approach. Start with facts and separate stories from reality. So it's really important for us from the get-go to know this is the fact, this is the story I'm telling myself about the fact, and this is how I feel about that. If you can separate those three things, you're going to be so much further ahead. And you're going to be in a position whereby when you're communicating, you're going to know when they're communicating facts, when they're communicating their stories, and when they're communicating their feelings. And that means you can recognize and validate their feelings. You can invite them to expand and thereby hopefully challenge some of their stories. And you can find common ground with them when it comes to the facts. But you're going to be a lot more likely to succeed if you're able to clearly articulate facts and the difference with stories and the difference with emotions as well. It's important for you to explore emotions without blame. Try to avoid gaslighting people as well. Sometimes it's like, I don't know why you're making a big deal about it. It's not, you're freaking out about this. We really want to make sure that we're validating another person's feelings. If you don't understand why a person's reacting the way they do, you got two options. One option, which I think is the stupid option, is to go, they're overreacting so terribly. What an overreaction. Oh my goodness. The second option is to be able to go, okay, why? Let me understand it. Let me try to figure out why are they feeling this way? And spend some time actively trying to find out why they're feeling this way. The more that we do that, the more likely we are to be able to put ourselves in the best possible position. Another strategy is make sure you create a psychologically safe environment. Make sure people feel comfortable enough to communicate what's real for them, what's true for them, that they don't feel attacked. We're using tentative language, for example, it seems to me, or I get this sense, as opposed to judging them or labeling them or attacking them. We want to listen actively. And it doesn't mean that we go, oh, I'm going to paraphrase everything, but it does mean that we're really hearing what it is that they have to say. And we're trying to understand what they are really saying, the subtext of their communication. We're empathizing with their needs. There's a concept great framework called positions, interests, needs. It's called the PIN model, sometimes used in negotiation, but also useful in any difficult conversation. The position is what they say they want. The interest is why they want it. And the needs are what they ultimately absolutely need. And as you converse with people, a lot of times you might have different positions than them, but fundamentally you might agree on the same needs. You might have the same core values. I did an interview with Bill M. Jones recently, and in that, one of the things we talked about was he was talking about him and his friend and how they both have very, very different perspectives. I think he was talking about gun control. But as he described it, he talked about how it came down to the fact that both of them had the same kind of core need, the core value underneath of that. And that's what they were able to find common ground on, right? So again, it's a great example of understanding the difference between the needs versus the stories that they're telling themselves and the facts and whatnot. Then be curious and encourage testing. So again, try to ask questions and try to test so that you truly understand the other person's point of view. And always finish on clear next step. What are we going to do moving forward? What's the best actions we can take? Difficult conversations, some of them may never be easy, but if you can use some of these techniques and use some of these skills, it will allow you to be a lot more effective at the conversations that you have to have. So if you're delivering feedback, if you're talking about delivering a challenging update or bad news, if you're communicating about something that you know is not going to be interpreted positively by the other person, the key is for you to spend a bit of time beforehand to think through how can I make this difficult conversation go as effectively as possible. Because as we're talking about, these conversations are crucial. And the better you are at having difficult conversations, the more you're able to really impact the people that you're working with and the more influential you will be because you'll be communicating with the people that you need to communicate with when you need to communicate with them. So really important that we master this skill. So I really hope you found this useful. I hope it wasn't too difficult for you to tune into. But it's crucial that you pay attention because I believe in being nonviolent in the way in which I put my messages across, and I hope you can too. But for now, take care, be well. As always, may the force be with you. May you review and share and let people know about this podcast. And please, if you're watching on YouTube, let us know in the comments what your favorite part was. For now, take care. I'll talk to you soon.